Why do smart leaders go silent when the stakes are the highest? Not average leaders, not inexperienced leaders, but the leaders that everybody's depending on. The ones who have the experience, the title, the respect, and even know exactly what needs to be said. Why do they suddenly hesitate? Why does their confidence seem to disappear right when clarity matters the most? Because if you've ever driven home just replaying a meeting in your head, then you already know what I'm talking about, right? Where you don't replay the conversations that went well, you end up replaying the ones where you knew, meaning that you knew what needed to be said. You even rehearsed it. You had the sentence, you had the example, you had the courage until the moment arrived. And then something happened. You kind of softened it. You changed the wording. You laughed when you shouldn't have laughed. You smiled because it kind of made the room feel more comfortable. And you convinced yourself, hey, I'll bring it up next time. And everybody else left the meeting thinking, hey, that went pretty well. But you got in your car and the meeting started all over again, but not out loud. It was just in your head. Why didn't I say it? Why did I back off? Why do I keep doing this? Now, here's what's interesting. Most people think difficult conversations are difficult because they don't know what to say. I don't believe that. In fact, I think that's one of the biggest lies that leadership has ever been taught. Because after coaching executives for more than 20 years, I've noticed something. Most leaders, they don't have a communication problem, they have an identity problem. And until you solve that, no communication framework in the world is going to save you. So think about this. How many leadership books have you read? How many podcasts, seminars? How many articles titled Five Steps to Difficult Conversations or the Feedback Formula or the Perfect Accountability Script, right? We've become so obsessed, right, with strategy or preparing for conversations, and we neglect mindset. Right? We neglect identity. Who are we when we are communicating, when we are the communicator, right? But here's another question that nobody asked. Who is preparing the person who's about to have this conversation? Because I've watched two leaders use the almost identical words and they create completely different outcomes. One conversation is built on trust, where the other conversation ends up building distance. It's the same message, same fact, different leader. And that tells me something. The words weren't doing the heavy lifting, the leader was. Now, the Harvard Business Review, they've repeatedly emphasized that effective leadership conversations depend not only on communication techniques, but also on creating the conditions for candor and psychological safety. So, in other words, people respond to the environment that a leader is creating, not just the script that the leader is following. And I agree with that. But I think it goes even deeper because before you can create safety for anybody else, you've already created a story in your own mind. And that's the conversation that nobody sees. See, I don't think every difficult conversation has one conversation. I think it has two, right? There's the conversation you're about to have with another person, and then there's a conversation that you're already having with yourself that goes something like this. Listen, don't upset them. Don't disappoint them. Don't look incompetent. Don't lose their respect. Don't make this awkward, right? So you're kind of think that you're preparing this for this opening sentence, but what you're actually doing is negotiating with your own fear, doubts, and hesitations. And that's why your words change, not because you forgot them, because the person speaking them has changed. So that realization kind of changed everything for me because I remember one particular afternoon I was sitting in my office preparing for a conversation that I knew that I could not avoid. I had a legal pad and that pad was filled with notes, questions I wanted to ask, possible objections that they might raise, possible responses, examples, evidence, all the things. I was prepared, right, for every version of this conversation except for one, the version of me who was going to walk into the room, and that thought stopped me. I pushed all my notes aside, pulled out a blank sheet of paper, and across the top, I wrote one sentence. Be the leader this conversation requires. Not be impressive, not be liked, not be right, but be the leader that this moment is requiring. See, that single sentence changed how I prepare for every difficult conversation because from that day forward, I stopped asking, what am I going to say? And I started asking, Who needs to walk into this room? That is the conversation before the conversation. And once you see it, you'll never prepare for leadership in the same way again. So, what if you've been preparing the wrong person? Not the employee, not the boss, not the client, but you. Because here's what I believe: every difficult conversation is an identity test that's disguised as a communication challenge. Because, see, every difficult conversation, once again, is an identity test that's disguised as a communication challenge. Now, that's why the conversation feels so heavy. It's rarely because of what the person is thinking, what might happen out there, but it's because of what might happen in here. Okay. Think about the last difficult conversation that you avoided. Was it really because you didn't know what to say? Probably not. You knew. The words were not the problem. The version of you who was saying those words was. See, most of us, we've been carrying these invisible rules for so long that we mistake them for actually being personality. Like, I'm just not confrontational, or I'm just a people pleaser, I'm just conflict avoidant. Maybe, or maybe those aren't personality traits at all. Maybe they're decisions, old decisions, decisions that you made about yourself years ago that your life is still obeying today. And that's what I call a standing decision. Now, a standing decision is a decision that you've made about yourself, about other people, about the world. It just continues making decisions for you long after you've forgotten that you ever made that standing decision. So these standing decisions, they're invisible. They're also automatic, and they're running in the background of every difficult conversation that you'll ever have. For example, somewhere along the way, maybe you decided, if people are disappointed in me, then I failed. Nobody taught you that in leadership school, but somewhere, a teacher, a parent, a coach, an experience, it somehow planted that belief. And now every difficult conversation gets filtered through that standing decision. So instead of asking what's true, you're asking, how do I keep them from being disappointed? Now, can you feel the difference there? See, one question produces leadership when the other produces avoidance. Or maybe your standing decision sounds like this: if they get upset, I've done something wrong. So the moment those emotions rise, you back down, not because you're weak, but because your standing decision is stronger than your intention. And that's something that most leadership books never address, because they assume behavior starts with a skill. I do not. I know it doesn't. I believe that behavior starts with belief. See, this is where I started noticing something that was, I thought, fascinating. The leaders who grew the fastest weren't necessarily becoming better communicators, they were becoming different people. Not fake people, just more integrated, more aligned people. People who stopped borrowing confidence from their approval. People who stopped measuring success by whether everybody liked them. People who became anchored. And see, when your identity becomes anchored, your conversation becomes steadier. It's not easier, but steadier. See, there's a difference, because difficult conversations never stop being difficult, but they do stop controlling you. And that brings me to another idea that's become kind of the foundation of my flagship program, which is called Built for This. It's something that I call the identity lag. And here's what identity lag is: it's the distance between the responsibilities that you've been given and the identity that you've accepted. So think about that. Have you ever been promoted while secretly wondering if everybody who was involved in my promotion has made a mistake, right? Have you ever sat in the executive chair while still feeling like the newest employee who's in the room? Have you ever had authority without feeling authorized? See, that's identity lag. Your title changed, your identity did not. Your responsibilities grew faster than your self perception. And here's why that matters: because pressure doesn't create insecurity, pressure reveals it. See, the meeting didn't make you afraid, the promotion didn't create self doubt. The difficult conversation did not invent your insecurity. It simply exposed the identity that you were living from. So, research on executive transitions, they consistently show that one of the biggest challenges that new leaders face is not technical competence. It's adapting psychologically to the expectations of leadership. So, the role changes overnight, but the internal picture of who they are often changes much more slowly. And that's identity lag. And if you've ever thought, one day I'll finally feel like a leader, I've got news. Leadership, it's not something that you eventually feel. It's someone you decide to become. So now, I want to say something that might challenge you. You don't rise to the level of your title. You don't rise to the level of your experience. You don't even rise to the level of your intentions. You rise or fall to the level of the identity that you've been practicing, which means that if every difficult conversation feels exhausting, then the solution isn't to memorize another communication framework. It's to examine who is walking into the room. Because the person walking into the room is determining the conversation long before the first word is ever spoken. And once I understood that, I stopped preparing speeches. I started preparing myself. That changed everything because every conversation I had after that began with three questions. And these are not communication questions, these are leadership questions. And those three questions have become the foundation of how I lead today. So, who walks into the room? That's the question, not what's the perfect script, not how do I make sure that they don't get upset, not how do I win this conversation or discussion that I'm about to have with them? The better question is, who does this moment require me to become? Because every difficult conversation is asking something from you before it ever asks anything from anybody else. And after years of coaching leaders, I found myself coming back to the same three questions, not because they're clever, but because they work. Not as a communication tool, but as an identity tool. So the first question is this: who does this person need me to be? Notice I didn't ask, who do I feel like being? Because your feelings make terrible leaders. And some days you'll feel courageous, some days you'll feel intimidated, some days you'll feel patient, some days you'll feel defensive. Leadership was never about following your feelings. Leadership is choosing who you're going to be before your emotions choose for you. And sometimes this person needs you to be compassionate. Sometimes they need you to be direct. Sometimes they need encouragement. Sometimes they may need to be held accountable. And sometimes the most loving thing that you can do is refuse to rescue someone from the consequences that they've created. Because leaders don't exist to make people comfortable. Leaders exist to help people grow, and growth has never been comfortable. The second question is, what does truth require? Not what makes everybody happy, not what keeps the peace. Truth. Because here's what I've learned: peace built on avoidance is not peace, it's postponement. See, you're not protecting the relationship, you're delaying the fracture. And here's the irony of all of that: the conversation that you're avoiding today is usually going to become the crisis that you're forced to have 6 months from now. Truth has a way of introducing itself. You just get to decide whether it arrives through wisdom or if it arrives through consequences. Then comes the third question. And for me, this is the one that changes everything. What does love require? Now, before you dismiss that word because it sounds soft, I just need you to hear me out. Love is not the absence of truth. Love is the reason truth matters. Because truth without love, it becomes harsh, and love without truth is dishonest. So leadership is going to require both. That's why I tell executives all the time, if you have to choose between being liked and being loving, choose loving, because they're not the same thing. Being liked is about protecting your image. Being loving is about serving the other person's growth. Sometimes those are completely different decisions. So think about the best leader you've ever worked with. What made them unforgettable? Was it their communication framework? Probably not. Was it because they always had the perfect words? Nope, not that either. You trusted them because you always knew who was walking into the room. They were consistent. They were grounded. They were honest. They were present. They didn't become someone different when the pressure increased. Pressure revealed who they'd already decided to be. That is leadership. So imagine what would happen if before every difficult conversation, instead of rehearsing your opening sentence, you rehearsed which or who you would be, rehearsed your identity. Imagine walking into the room already decided, already anchored, already settled, not wondering, not saying to yourself, I hope this goes well, but knowing no matter how this goes, I already know who I'm going to be. That's freedom, because confidence doesn't come from controlling outcomes. Confidence comes from deciding your identity isn't up for negotiation. So I want to leave you with something. The conversation that you've been avoiding probably isn't the biggest conversation of your life. The biggest conversation is the one that you've been having with yourself, the one that says, don't disappoint anyone. Don't make any mistakes. Don't let them see that you're uncertain. Keep everybody happy. That conversation is shaping every conversation that you have with everyone else, which means the greatest leadership breakthrough that you're ever going to experience may not even happen in a boardroom. It may happen the moment you stop believing the voice that has been leading you for years. Because here's what I know: leadership isn't about becoming someone that you're not. It's about refusing to let fear introduce itself as you. That's why I created Built for This, my flagship program, not to teach people how to communicate better. There's thousands of books that can help with that. I created Built for This because I believe the greatest limitation in leadership isn't a lack of skill. It's an identity that no longer matches your assignment. And when your identity catches up, your conversations change, your relationships change, your leadership changes, not because you learned a better script, but because a different leader walked into the room. So here's my challenge to you. Before your next difficult conversation, don't ask yourself, what am I going to say? Ask yourself, who needs to walk into that room? Write that answer down, become that person, then have that conversation. Because the conversation before the conversation will always determine the conversation that everybody remembers. And never forget this: you were not promoted by accident. You were not entrusted with influence by accident. You weren't given this assignment by accident. You were built for this. Where did I go?